Hello again, students. This week we are going to be talking about the Southern economy. Last week we learned a little bit about the Northern economy and how they were driven by factories and manufacturing and making things and warehouses. And this week we're going to shift our focus to the Southern economy. And the Southern economy, as we've talked about in class, was driven not by manufacturing but by agriculture and farming and cash crops. And we'll talk about some of those things here in a couple minutes. Uh, this week we will also talk a little bit about slavery and why the Southern economy relied on slavery for all of that agriculture. Next week, we'll start talking a little bit about the Western economy and land and how that worked. So, the first thing we want to do today is I want to ask you this question. In the United States today, modern day, what do you think is the number one cash crop that is grown in the United States? What is the number one crop? And your choices there are corn, soybeans, wheat, or hay. What is the number one crop grown in the United States today? Corn, soybeans, wheat, or hay? So take a minute, think about what you think the answer to that might be. If you want to pause the video and think about it, you can, but I'm going to answer here in a second. The answer is that number 4 on the list is hay. Number 3 on the list is wheat. Number 2 on the list is soybeans. And number 1 on the list is corn. Corn is the number one crop grown in the United States today. So with that in mind, I want to ask you a second poll question. What was the number one crop grown in the United States before 1800? Was it corn, wheat, or tobacco? And we've talked about this in class before, so it should be something that you remember, but feel free to think about it, pause the video and think about it for a second. The answer is that the number one crop grown in the South before 1800 was tobacco. And that was largely due in part to tobacco being something that they started farming at Jamestown in the 1620s when John Rolfe showed up. So today's number one crop is corn. Back then the number one crop was tobacco. But what happened in 1800 that changed all of that? Well, as I mentioned a minute ago, the Southern economy before 1800, 3 crops dominated. Tobacco was number one, then rice and indigo. Remember, indigo is that kind of purple colored dye that was used in clothing and curtains and bed sheets and things like that. But something does happen. In 1793, a guy named Eli Whitney invents something. And so which one of these things do you think he invented? Did he invent the battery, the cotton gin, the steel plow, or the sewing machine? So pause the video for a second, think about that, and then I'll give you the answer. Well, in 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And the cotton gin was a machine that allowed you to separate the seed from the cotton in a way that before this had been done all by hand, where workers, mainly slaves, would be out in the fields and they would literally be picking the seeds out of the cotton, putting the rest of the cotton into a bag as they harvested it throughout the day. Now you had a machine, the cotton gin, that could do that for you. And so this was monumental. This changed the economy of the South because cotton became the number one crop grown in the South. It took the place of tobacco because it was a huge moneymaker. In fact, it earned the nickname King Cotton because it was such a big moneymaker in the South. So here you can see a statistic to back up what I was just talking about. In 1793, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin, and cotton sales increased from 2 million pounds a year in 1791 to 1 billion pounds in 1860. So in 70 years, the amount of cotton went from 2 million pounds a year being harvested to 1 billion pounds a year. That is a tremendous increase. These two maps really kind of show you the difference of what those numbers we're talking about. In 1820 in the South, you can see these yellow areas are area where cotton was grown, and there's one big concentration here in the Georgia, South Carolina area that was red. But just 40 years later in 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, this right here is what cotton growth looked like in the South. Huge, huge, huge increase. By the way, the invention of the cotton gin had a big part in the Civil War happening, which we'll talk more about here in a little bit. So I want to ask you this question that goes along with what I just mentioned. What do you think the impact of the cotton gin was on slavery in the South? I want you to think about, did this machine that now made it easier to get cotton, Would that have reduced the need for slaves, or would that have increased the desire of southern plantation owners to have slaves? So pause the video for a second and think about that, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Well, I hope that you thought about this question of whether or not the cotton gin actually increased slavery or decreased slavery. Common sense would kind of say, look, if there's a machine that can now harvest cotton and separate the seed from the cotton much easier, wouldn't that mean that the southern plantation owners would have less of a need for slaves? And you would think that. That makes common sense. But in fact, the opposite happened. The southern plantation owners started to, they basically decided, I need more. I need more cotton. I need more slaves so that I can harvest more cotton and make more money using these machines. And it was a pretty horrific impact that it had on slavery, because now more southern farmers and plantation owners wanted to have more slaves, and the growing conflict between the southern states and the northern states who were moving away from slavery was increasing to the point where it would lead to us having a civil war, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. Couple of vocab things that I think you should know. Number one, the cotton belt. The cotton belt is refers to that area of high production across the South that I just showed you the video of, the picture of here a second. This is the cotton belt along here, where you had these huge areas that were used for growing cotton during this kind of 1800 to 1860 period of time where cotton was in fact king. And then you have cash crops. Cash crop is something that is grown on a large scale for a profit. So if my family are farmers and I grow corn, and I grow enough corn to feed my family, that's not a cash crop. But if I grow so much corn that it's more than my family needs and I take it to the market and sell it, that has now become a cash crop. And then just two more vocab terms that you're going to want to know. Planters were these large-scale farmers who had more than 20 slaves, okay? And the farms that they owned were then called plantations. Planters were the farmers themselves. Plantations were the farms where they had these huge amounts of fields and crops, and also oftentimes many slaves, sometimes 400 or 500 slaves on one plantation. And then yeomen were the smaller farmers. They owned much smaller farms and oftentimes had less than 20 slaves. Many yeomen would have as few as 2 or 3 or 4 slaves, and a lot of times those farmers were not rich in any way, and they had to be out in the fields working right alongside their slaves. This was not the case every time, but slaves were often treated better in these yeoman farm situations than they were in the big plantation farms. But that's not the case every time, but that did happen with some frequency. So you want to know the difference between planters, were the farmers that owned large plantations with more than 20 slaves, and the yeomen were the small farmers who had less than 20 slaves, and or sometimes no slaves at all. So that's it for this video. Go ahead and take the quiz that accompanies the video. If you have questions, let me know. And the rest of your assignments this week will deal with this Southern economy and slavery.